Hey everybody, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Westminster Wednesday, where each week we look at one question from the Westminster Shorter Catechism and explore its meaning and significance for our lives today. And in the last episode, we saw that the duty which God requires of man is obedience to his revealed will. And now we're going to look in this episode more closely at what we mean by God's revealed will. What is it specifically that requires our obedience? So question number 40 asks, what did God at first reveal to man for the rule of his obedience? And the answer is the rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law. Now, this question talks about the moral law, so we need to understand what the moral law is. And in order to really understand what the moral law is, we need to see that in the Old Testament law, there were actually three types of law, three big categories of law that God gave to his people. The first category is the civil law. And the civil laws were the commands that governed ancient Israelite society. So these were the rules and the regulations of the nation of Israel, as well as the punishments for breaking those rules and regulations. So, for example, there were rules about property, there were rules about personal injury, there were rules about restitution. All of these fall into the category of civil laws. The second category was the ceremonial law, and all of the ceremonial laws were the regulations that pertained to Israelite worship and the rituals of ancient Israel. So these included all the laws about sacrifices, all the laws about the priesthood, and the laws about the tabernacle and various feasts and festivals. Those were ceremonial laws. And then the third category is the moral law. And the moral laws are those moral imperatives that God gave his people about how he wanted them to live. These are God's unchanging standards of right and wrong. And the heart of the moral law is found in the Ten Commandments. We might say that the Ten Commandments are a summary of God's moral law. So we have these three types of law, the civil law, ceremonial law, and moral law. And it brings up the question then, for Christians today, which of these laws are we required to obey? Which of these laws are still binding upon us? Are all of them binding, or are only some of them binding? And the answer is that the New Testament makes clear that after the coming of Christ, Christians are no longer bound by the civil law and the ceremonial law, but we're still bound by God's moral law. We're no longer bound by the civil law because God's people no longer exist as a nation. And since God's people now come from every nation, we are no longer bound by those laws that were specific to ancient Israel. And the New Testament instead instructs us to obey whatever civil authorities and civil laws that we find ourselves living under. Whatever nation we live under, we're to obey the civil laws of that nation. So we're no longer bound by the civil law. We're also no longer bound by the ceremonial law. And the reason for this is because the New Testament makes clear that all of the ceremonial laws about the sacrifices and the priesthood and the tabernacle and the temple, all of those pointed forward to Christ and were fulfilled in Christ, so that after the coming of Christ, those laws become obsolete because they have all been fulfilled in him. So we're no longer required to be bound by the civil law or the ceremonial law. However, the New Testament makes clear that the moral law is still binding upon God's people. The reason for this is simple. God's standards of right and wrong, his unchanging moral standards for his people, are the same no matter what generation we live in. Whether we live in Old Testament times or in New Testament times, God's unchanging moral standards always apply to our lives. And that's why the New Testament reaffirms the moral law and makes clear that even though the civil and ceremonial laws are no longer binding upon God's people, his moral law still applies. Now, this is hugely important as we think about living in the world today, because many people in the world today want to invent their own laws for their lives. They want to live life by their own rules and invent their own standards of right and wrong. But Christians recognize that we're accountable to a higher standard. To read again the words of the Catechism, it says, "The rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law." That is his moral law, his standards of right and wrong. And so that same rule, which God at first revealed to man, is still applicable and still binding upon our lives today and continues to require our obedience in every single generation.